welcome to RT's special election night coverage. I'm Megan Lopez.
And I'm Sam Sachs, and we're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. 57 times. This is the 57th time Americans have gone to the polls to elect a new president of the United States. And this year, we choose between President Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, plus a lot of third-party candidates who, well, they just can't get any respect. These election days usually come with a lot of flag waving, a lot of patriotism, a lot of those I voted stickers, and we should be proud of our election day. We invented this whole idea of peaceful transitions of government, and we continue it still. There should be flag waving, and there's plenty of it if you look around today. But there's also reality. Now, this is the scene in New Jersey, where Americans are casting votes in hurricane shelters surrounded by cots. Some are even voting in military trucks since their precincts were destroyed. It's been 1 week since Hurricane Sandy hit, sinking American cities like Hoboken and Seaside Heights, and a growing number of us are wondering if these storms will be more frequent on a hotter planet.
And also at polling places around the nation, UN election observers are on site monitoring voters and poll workers to watch out for any alleged voter suppression. For the last 2 years, state legislatures and courts around the nation have been battling new voter ID laws and new restrictions on voter registration and early voting hours that could affect millions of minority voters across the nation.
And Americans are voting in Freeport, Illinois, where a local factory was closed down just yesterday, laying off 170 American workers. The factory was doing just fine, but a decision was made by ownership that a cheap foreign labor would be more profitable. You know, since banks crashed the economy in 2008, more than 660,000 Americans have lost their jobs in that same way, a symptom of deep structural economic problems. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of members of our military around the world who voted this year, as well as our nation's longest war ever continues in Afghanistan. But the point is, people are voting, and that's a good thing. We've gone to the polls 57 times, and many of those election days were during times of crisis. We've elected presidents during a civil war, during world wars, during Great Depressions, amid social upheaval, rain, snow, sunshine. We vote for president every 4 years.
And that's the beautiful thing about our democracy. Once every 4 years, the power shifts away from the hands of the government and into the hands of the people to decide the future of the nation. And on this election day, with so many political, social, and economic issues at stake, we can't afford to cover this election like a horse race, like the corporate mainstream news networks do. If you want to see that debacle going on Election Day, where the media coverage is, the reporters are literally ripping the vote printouts of the polling monitors' hands, you can watch them. But here, we'll be reporting the news that we feel Americans need to know on Election Day. RT's America's programming will be broadcasted globally throughout the election coverage tonight. So we want to welcome our international audience as well as our viewers right here in the U.S. We have a special show planned for you that will take us all the way until the final polling stations have been closed, the votes tallied, and the 2012 presidential election called. We are going to cover this election in ways that you won't see on other news stations. Ready? All right, let's get started.
So every election, we hear the same thing. It's the economy, stupid. So let's kick things off tonight talking about the economy and how much this election will or will not affect our economy.
And to break it all down for us, we're joined by RT's own Capital Account host Lauren Lister and producer Dimitri Kofinas. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's start off by talking about how important the economy is in this election and whether anything is going to change either under President Obama or Mitt Romney. Lauren, I'll start with you.
Well, let's see. I would say the economy is the most important thing because it kind of all starts with the economy. And as we know, the U.S. is not in a very good situation in regards to its economy. I think as far as the candidates and how much this will really matter, I think that many of the issues impacting the U.S. economy are not ones that you really see these candidates addressing. The Federal Reserve's policies. You can't have a healthy economy, I would argue, and I think Dimitri would too, with the kind of control that the Federal Reserve is exerting right now on interest rates and in terms of liquidity. So that's one issue that we really haven't heard get a lot of play in this presidential election at all. The debt and the deficit are major issues, and I don't think that either of these candidates have a compelling plan. And I say either because obviously they're third-party candidates, but I guess I'm just having the same bias as other people in terms of talking about their Mitt Romney and Barack Obama's plans. In addition, you can't have a healthy economy without a healthy banking system, and neither of these guys have taken on Wall Street or are likely to.
Well, focusing on just Barack Obama and Mitt Romney.
Sure.
There seems to be a distinction between the two, and I'll contend that the president has embraced some sort of deficit reduction. He's on board with the idea of cutting spending. He's actually cut a lot of spending during the last year. And he floated this idea of a $4 trillion plan to reduce the deficit. But by and large, this issue of austerity, Mitt Romney has embraced it. And this isn't a Democrat versus Republican issue. We have a clip from last night's third-party debate, which was right here on RT. And Jill Stein and Gary Johnson were battling over austerity, too, if we can play that clip here. Okay, no clip there. But basically...
We'll take your word for it, Sam.
Basically, Gary Johnson says, hey, I'm all about austerity or we're going to have a monetary crisis, where Jill Stein says, well, austerity has a track record of not working, and if it's going to work in the United States, it'll be the first time it's ever worked. What is the role of austerity, and is it really the best idea for a nation in a recession to be pursuing austerity?
Let me ask you this. What do you mean by austerity? I mean, austerity can be any number of things. It's kind of this blanket term that's become a bad word to make anybody afraid to have any real conversations about what kind of tax policy and spending policy would be most appropriate given the economy and the role that citizens want their government to have in it. So I think that would be the first thing I'd want to know.
Okay, I think it could be defined two ways. So you could define it as strictly reducing spending to control a deficit or a national debt.
So any reducing of spending is austerity?
Well, that's one definition. The other is we have to figure out what what role government plays in our lives. What programs should we be cutting under this austerity agenda? So, look, you could try and reduce deficit by raising taxes on wealthy people, or you can do it by cutting social programs like Medicare, like Medicaid, like food stamps. It really gets down to the priorities we hold as a nation. I think that's up for grabs a little bit in this election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Which of those candidates are really reflecting American ideals?
I didn't see the clip, but you said Jill Stein said that austerity doesn't work.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's just, that's silly. Let me explain why that's silly. I'm not saying that austerity works or doesn't work. What's silly is this notion that exists out there. I guess Jill Stein prescribes to that. People like Paul Krugman do as well, which is we need to spend because when you don't spend, you have an economic crash. Look at Greece, for example. They say they enacted austerity, and now the economy is contracting. The GDP is contracting. Debt is exploding relative to GDP, even though they're cutting spending. All right. So they're achieving nothing. But that's absurd, right? It's absurd. Why? Because you're not actually creating sustainable growth. How do you get sustainable growth in an economy? You have real investment. Spending is invested in order to create productive capacity that overall, after you're done with whatever investment you had, 15, 20, 30 years out, you've got more wealth in the economy than you had when you started. Not simply spending willy-nilly, because, yeah, that'll increase GDP in the short run, but all you've done is you've expanded your debt, you've increased malinvestment in the economy, maybe you built a shopping mall in the middle of a cornfield, all right? Expecting that retailers would fill that out. Retailers are nowhere to be seen. Now you've got an empty building. All right, those workers are no longer working that built it. And you've got. And the point is, you can't grow corn on that field, and all the people that needed that corn that could have used it now are starving.
Okay, and Megan, you can jump in here in just a second. We're in a situation in which this private sector is not spending, which seems to be our situation now. You have corporations sitting on $2 trillion worth of cash, not spending it. You have consumers sitting at home, afraid to spend money. Isn't the government's role during those times to step in and be the spender and the employer of last resort?
No, absolutely not. Well, no. But let me just say, that's actually absolutely incorrect. Because if you're the employer and spender of last resort, what are you doing? Once again, you're creating malinvestment. That's not the way you grow an economy, by saying, let's just spend. You will actually create GDP growth for a period of time. But that's like saying, I go to the doctor and I have a lump in my chest, and the doctor says, something's growing in there. Well, is that good, doctor? Well, I don't know. Are you a teenage girl or are you a 40-year-old woman?
So you think Mitt Romney has a better plan when it comes to this?
No, I don't, because the thing that I would argue is that when it comes down to it, Republicans and Democrats get into office, they get into Washington and the White House, and you have Congress to deal with, and nobody cuts spending. You grow spending. It doesn't matter if you're Republican and Democrat. So I don't really care what kind of a plan you have before you're elected into office. I care what you do when you're in it. And what we've seen is candidates that don't actually follow through with the proposed cuts cuts that they lay out. And for Romney, he's saying cap spending at 20% of GDP. That's more aggressive than what Simpson Bowles laid out. And that's something that people like you, Sam, would have called what, cat food? Like fat cat food or something. But anyway, my point is that there's a real big difference between what's proposed and what actually gets enacted. So I'm hesitant to say that anybody that's proposed any kind of spending cuts really has me convinced. And on the note of Obama, because you mentioned those $4 trillion in cuts, this just shows kind of the mumbo jumbo that goes on in Washington. Because involved in that $4 trillion plan are things like savings on ending the war in Afghanistan. Okay, that's not money that you've like put aside in a rainy day fund to spend on war in Afghanistan. That's money that would have been deficit spending that now is not. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
And one of the top topics here that we have is talking about jobs. So let's go ahead and shift the conversation a little bit to jobs. And what we're seeing is that Mitt Romney, in his plan, he's saying that he wants to increase, and he has a plan to get Americans 12 million jobs. But everything that I understand from all the economic analysis that I've read is that those 12 million jobs are planned anyway. And more importantly, in order to be able to do any of these things that you guys are talking about, you have to be able to get Congress on your side. So let's talk about whether Mitt Romney or Barack Obama's job plan will work. And also, let's talk about a little bit about Congress. And if Barack Obama potentially wins, can he get anything done with a Republican Congress, a Republican House? And what about, on the other hand, Mitt Romney?
Let me just say, and then Lauren would be, I think, better suited to discuss some of the political matters. But on the face of it, it's hypocritical and outrageous for Mitt Romney to say that he can create 12 million jobs. That goes against everything he's saying. He's acting like Mr. Free Market, and then he's saying, we'll create 12 million jobs. He doesn't know how many jobs he's going to create. He has absolutely no idea. It's an outrageous number, but you know what? It's political, and it feeds into people's desire and need to have answers. So anyway,
Absolutely.
Lauren, we've got 30 seconds. You get
Well,
the
that's
last
exactly
one.
what I would have said. You know, the government doesn't create jobs, and Mitt Romney would be the first to say that, but then he says, oh, but my plan is going to create 12 million. So I would argue that the government doesn't create jobs, but the government can create the kind of circumstances in which businesses can invest, want to invest, and that you can fuel job growth. As to which candidate, I'm not convinced that either would do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess we're saying when it comes down to it, the President Obama is asking for a pretty modest tax increase on the rich, where it was during Clinton levels, not at all where it was during the New Deal era, where it was upwards of 90%. So really, there isn't that much significant difference between the two candidates when it comes to fundamental
Except during the New Deal, all the big rich
Sorry, we got to
families
go.
got to put their
All
money
right,
in
you got it,
trusts.
Dimitri. Lauren Lister, Dimitri Kofinas with the Capital Account. Thanks for the economic outlook of today's elections, and we'll be talking about these issues all night.
Thank you very much, guys.
Absolutely.
All right,